Pick it up. Hold it in your palm. Feel the weight of it. Not much, maybe half an ounce. The kind of weight that seems inconsequential until you understand what it represents. It is roughly the size of a quarter, stamped from aluminum or zinc or occasionally brass, depending on the year and the company and how much they wanted to spend on the theater of legitimacy. On one face, a number, 50 cents, $1, sometimes a fraction, 25 cents, 10 cents, because the system worked better when it reached down into the smallest transactions of a human life. On the other face, or sometimes ringing the edge in small stamped letters, a name. Cabell Consolidated Coal, Monarch Mills, Pullman Palace Car Company. The name changes depending on where you found the thing, but the logic is always the same. This is not a coin. Let's be precise about that from the start, because precision matters when you're describing a mechanism this elaborate. A coin is issued by a government and accepted everywhere within that government's jurisdiction. This thing, this scrip token, is issued by a company and accepted exactly one place, the company store. You cannot take it to the bank in the next town. You cannot mail it to your sister in Pittsburgh to help with her rent. You cannot save it up, convert it, or carry it with you when you leave, because leaving, really leaving with your family and your life and your future, is precisely what it was designed to prevent. It looks like money. It spends like money, in one store, owned by the man who gave it to you instead of actual money. Welcome to the company town. Your boss doesn't just own your labor, he owns your breakfast. The company town is one of those American institutions that seems, at sufficient historical distance, too complete to be real. Surely, you think, some part of the worker's life remained their own. Surely the company owned the mine or the mill, but not the houses, or owned the houses but not the store, or owned the store but not the church. Surely something remained outside the circuit, some small corner of daily existence that a man or woman could call their own without a company ledger somewhere recording the transaction. Surely. No. At their peak, roughly 1880 to 1930, with significant remnants well into the 1950s, there were over 2,500 company towns operating in the United States, housing approximately 3% of the entire American population. 3% sounds small until you do the multiplication. In 1920, that was roughly 3 million people. 3 million people who lived in houses owned by their employer, bought food at stores owned by their employer, sent their children to schools funded by their employer, attended churches where the preacher's salary was paid by their employer, were policed by guards employed by their employer, received medical care from doctors hired by their employer, and were paid, when they were paid at all, in anything resembling cash, in currency that could only be spent at their employer's store. Other than that, they were perfectly free. The system was not a regional quirk. It was not a Southern pathology or an Appalachian peculiarity, though it certainly flourished in both. It was a national business model, applied with remarkable consistency across radically different industries in radically different geographies. Coal companies in West Virginia and Kentucky and Pennsylvania. Textile mills across North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. Lumber operations in Washington, Oregon, and Northern California, carved into forests so remote that the nearest independent town was 50 miles of muddy logging road away. Steel towns in Pennsylvania and Indiana, sugar plantations in Hawaii, company towns in the desert Southwest, where copper companies built entire cities to extract ore from ground that had no previous human habitation and no infrastructure to support one. The industries were different. The climates were different. The ethnic compositions of the workforce were different. Native-born white Appalachians in the coal towns, Eastern European immigrants in the Pennsylvania steel mills, Japanese and Filipino laborers on the Hawaiian sugar plantations, a mixing of native-born whites and black workers and immigrants in the Carolina textile mills. But the architecture of the trap was identical, replicated across a continent with the fidelity of a franchise, because it worked. The product was control. The profit was helplessness, and it worked extraordinarily well for the better part of 8 decades. To understand how it worked, really worked, at the level of a family's daily arithmetic, you need to meet Harley Bratcher. Harley Bratcher is 34 years old, in the autumn of 1912, and he has been working in the Black Ridge No. 2 mine outside Mingo County, West Virginia, for 11 years. He is not a stupid man. He is, in fact, a man with a reasonably precise mind for numbers, which is both a gift and a particular form of torture, given the circumstances of his life. He can calculate, almost instantly, the tonnage rate on any given seam of coal, the deduction schedule on a company store purchase, the compound effect of 3 months of overspending on scrip credit. The calculations never change in their conclusion. He does them anyway, the way a man with a toothache probes the sore tooth with his tongue, compulsively, unable to stop, as if the next time the arithmetic will somehow come out differently. It never does. Harley earns $2.10 per day in Black Ridge Company scrip, paid every 2 weeks on what the company calls Settlement Day. On Settlement Day, the men line up outside the company office and receive not cash, not legal tender, not any currency recognized by the United States government, but a small cloth envelope containing scrip tokens and a printed settlement sheet listing every deduction taken from their gross pay, before the envelope was sealed. Harley has 11 years of settlement sheets. He keeps them in a coffee tin under the floorboard near the door, because that is where he keeps things that matter, things he does not want the company to accidentally discover if they ever come into the house, which they have twice, looking for Union literature that Harley did not have, though not for lack of wanting. The settlement sheet for the first 2 weeks of October 1912 reads as follows. Gross earnings, $25.20. 12 days worked at the tonnage rate, which works out to roughly $2.10 per day. Give or take the quality of the seam and whether the company's scale was running honest that week, which it often wasn't. But that is a separate grievance requiring a separate accounting. From that $25.20, the company removes rent, $4, being half the monthly charge for the 4-room house on No. 7 row that Harley and his wife Irene and their 3 children, James, 9, Clara, 7, and the baby, who is called Pip and is 2.5, occupy without owning, without any prospect of owning, without any option of leaving for another house in the area, because there are no other houses in the area. The company built every structure in Black Ridge, and the company owns every structure in Black Ridge, and the geography of the mountains ensures that no competing landlord has ever found it economically worthwhile to build anything in the hollows around the mine entrance. Rent, $4. Powder and fuse, $1.75. In certain coal fields at this period, miners are required to purchase their own explosives for blasting coal from the seam. This is not a negligible expense. It is not an optional expense. You do not mine coal without powder. You do not get paid if you do not mine coal. Therefore, you buy powder from the company at company prices, deducted before you see a cent. Powder and fuse, $1.75. Smithing, 75 cents. The sharpening and maintenance of tools, also not optional, also deducted. Doctor's fee, 50 cents. The company employs a physician, Dr. Alton Marsh, whose practice is located in the company building at the north end of Black Ridge's single commercial street. Dr. Marsh is a competent enough man in most respects, though his competence is somewhat complicated by the fact that he is paid by the company, and therefore his most consequential professional judgment, whether an injured miner is well enough to return to work, involves a financial conflict of interest that even Dr. Marsh, who is not a bad man exactly, cannot entirely ignore. The fee is charged whether or not you visit Dr. Marsh that month. It is insurance, in the sense that the company is insuring itself against having to pay for catastrophic care out of company funds rather than worker funds. Doctor's fee, 50 cents. Coal, $1.50. This is the line on the settlement sheet that never fails to produce in Harley a small, specific, wordless fury. He mines coal. He spends his days underground in the dark and the dust and the gas-smelling air extracting coal from the earth. He loads it into cars. He blasts it loose with powder he buys from the company. He does this so that somewhere someone can burn coal to heat their home. And then he goes home to his company house in the company town, and he buys coal from the company at company prices to heat that home. He has mentioned this to Irene. Irene said, "I know, Harley," in the tone she uses when she means, "I know." And knowing doesn't help. And I need you to stop saying it out loud because the children can hear, and there's nothing to be done. Coal, $1.50. Church contribution, 25 cents. The Blackridge Methodist Church is a clean white building at the corner of Main and Company Row, and its preacher is a man named Reverend Dinsmore, who arrived from Virginia 3 years ago and gives sermons of a particular theological character. Not fire and brimstone, not hellfire, but a steady, mild emphasis on the virtues of contentment, patience, and the Christian acceptance of earthly station. Harley has heard Reverend Dinsmore preach that the relationship between a man and his employer is not unlike the relationship between a man and his God, one of dependence, gratitude, and appropriate submission. This contribution is technically voluntary. It appears on every settlement sheet. Harley has never heard of a man who declined it and avoided consequence. Church contribution, $0.25. Store credit repayment, $3.80. This is the month's principal payment on the accumulated balance at the Blackridge Company store, a balance that has existed in various amounts since Harley's first week of work in 1901 and has never, in 11 years, reached zero. The store credit line exists because workers frequently need more than their scrip balance covers before settlement day, and the company helpfully extends credit, at interest, charged as a percentage of the outstanding balance, compounded monthly, calculated by company clerks in a method that Harley has tried to verify and cannot, because the formula is proprietary. The current balance before this payment is $47.30. After this payment, it will be $43.50. This is progress, except that between now and the next settlement day, Irene will need to go to the store for flour, salt pork, dried beans, lamp oil, thread, and the children's shoes that James has worn through the soles of, and those purchases will be on scrip or store credit, and the balance will not be $43.50 by the time the next settlement sheet is printed. Store credit repayment, $3.80. Total deductions, $12.55. Remaining in the envelope, $12.65 in scrip. This is for 2 weeks. For the month, assuming Harley works every available day and no days are lost to weather or slatefall, or the mine's irregular production schedule, his monthly take-home is roughly $25.30 in scrip, from which there is still the second half of rent, $4, the continuing need to purchase food and necessities at the company store, and the ever-present balance on the store credit account. At the end of the month, after all store purchases are tallied, Harley typically owes somewhere between $1.80 and $3.50 more than he earned. He earned $2.10 a day. He ends the month in deeper debt than he began it. This has been true for 11 years. This is not an accident. It is the business model. A worker in debt is a worker who cannot leave. Leaving requires money for travel, for deposits on housing elsewhere, for food during the gap between jobs. A worker who owes the company money has no such reserves. More than that, in certain states during this period, A worker who attempts to leave employment while carrying a company debt can be arrested for breach of contract and vagrancy and returned legally to the mine. The debt is not merely inconvenient. The debt is a legal instrument. The debt is a chain made of arithmetic. A worker who cannot leave is a worker who cannot bargain. He cannot threaten to take his labor elsewhere, because elsewhere does not exist, or exists at a distance that requires resources he does not have. He cannot organize with his fellow workers, because the company police, the Baldwin Felts Detective Agency in much of the West Virginia coal fields, a private force with the legal authority of sworn deputies and the ethical compass of men paid specifically to discourage labor organization, will find the union cards and the meetings and the correspondence, and the consequence will be eviction, blacklisting, and the particular terror of a family with 3 small children standing on a dirt road with their furniture in November. A worker who cannot bargain is not an employee in any meaningful sense of the word. He is inventory. He is a resource to be extracted from, the same as the coal in the seam beneath his feet. Irene Bratcher knows this. She has known it for longer than Harley has known it, or at least she has known it more precisely, because the management of the family's finances has always fallen to her, and she is a woman who does not permit herself the luxury of approximate understanding. Approximate understanding is how you miss a deduction. Approximate understanding is how the balance grows. Irene's understanding of the Blackridge Company economy is exact, clinical, and shot through with a rage so carefully controlled that it occasionally frightens her, because the alternative to controlling it is expressing it, and expressing it is not something a woman in a company house with 3 children can afford. She can tell you the markup on every staple item at the company store without looking at a price list, because she has memorized the price list the way a navigator memorizes a chart, not from academic interest, but from survival necessity. Flour at the Blackridge store, 12 cents per pound. Flour at the independent store in Williamson, 23 miles away on a road that requires a horse and wagon or a seat on the company railroad, which costs 35 cents each way and runs on the company's schedule for the company's purposes, 7 cents per pound. Salt pork, 18 cents per pound at Blackridge, 11 cents per pound in Williamson. Lamp oil, 22 cents per quart at Blackridge, 14 cents per quart in Williamson. These are not rounding errors. These are 50 to 80% markups on the basic necessities of life, charged to people who have no alternative because the nearest alternative requires transportation they don't own, and time they don't have, and money they cannot carry in a currency they cannot spend outside of Blackridge. She stretches the script the way you stretch thin fabric, carefully, constantly, aware that one wrong cut ruins everything. She trades with other wives, a cup of dried beans for a cup of cornmeal, a length of thread for help with the mending, the small informal economy of scarcity that women in company towns developed because women in company towns understood the math better than anyone, and refused, quietly and absolutely, to simply accept it. She makes James's school clothes from flour sacks, because the flour comes in cotton sacking, and the cotton sacking can be washed and cut and sewn into passable shirts. She feeds the children before she feeds herself and Harley. She stretches the salt pork across 3 days of meals. She has never, in 11 years, purchased anything at the company store without calculating the markup first and the alternative second and the necessity last, and she buys a thing only when necessity wins the argument, which it usually does. The company store is a long wooden building on Blackridge's main street, and it sells everything: food, clothing, shoes, mining equipment, hardware, patent medicine, candy, tobacco, and whiskey. This comprehensiveness is not generosity. It is engineering. A store that sold only some of what a family needed would force workers to seek the rest elsewhere, and elsewhere is precisely what the company store is designed to eliminate. The store is run by a man named Crawford Tillis, who is not personally cruel, but who is personally aware that his employment depends on the store's margins, and the store's margins depend on workers having nowhere else to shop. And workers having nowhere else to shop depends on a geography that the company has carefully managed. There has been, in the past, an independent peddler who came through Blackridge selling dry goods from a wagon. He came twice. On his third attempt, the company road, the only road into Blackridge, was found to have a gate across it that the peddler was informed was for safety reasons related to mine operations. The peddler did not come back. This is not a story Crawford Tillis tells. It is a story everyone in Blackridge knows without telling. There is a ledger in Crawford Tillis's store. It is a large ledger, bound in black cloth, organized alphabetically by family name, and it records every purchase made on store credit by every family in Blackridge, with dates and amounts, and the accumulating balance. Harley Bratcher's page in that ledger covers 3 pages, because the original page filled up in 1904 and had to be continued. The balance has never hit 0. 11 years. Never 0. Not because Harley is a spendthrift. Irene would not permit a spendthrift to exist in her household, but because the arithmetic makes 0 impossible. The store prices plus the deductions plus the scrip limitations plus the debt interest equals a system in which a worker's deficit is structurally guaranteed. Crawford Tillis doesn't design the system. He simply operates it. The system was designed by people who understood that a store with captive customers and no competition can charge whatever it likes, and that the optimal price point is not maximum profit per transaction, but maximum debt per worker, because maximum debt creates maximum retention, and maximum retention is the whole point. The house on number 7 row is 3 rooms and a small lean-to that functions as a kitchen, built from raw pine planking that has never been properly seasoned and has consequently warped and gapped over the years until winter wind moves freely through the walls in a way that requires constant feeding of the stove. Coal, purchased from the company, to keep the interior temperature above dangerous. The roof leaks at the northeast corner, above where Clara sleeps, and Irene has put a bucket there so reliably that Clara sometimes forgets it's not a permanent feature of the room. The outhouse is shared with the Moorhead family next door, which means 6 adults and 4 children use a single structure in all weathers, and in summer, the smell reaches the back door of both houses. There is a water pump at the end of number 7 row, shared by all 8 households, and the water it produces has been, twice in the past 5 years, contaminated with runoff from the mine operation uphill, producing a week of illness among the children that Dr. Marsh attributed to seasonal constitutional weakness and treated at the standard per-visit rate, deducted from settlement. The house is the only house available. This bears repetition, because the natural human response to a description of 4 gapping walls and a leaking roof is to ask why the family doesn't simply move somewhere better. The answer is that the company owns every structure in Blackridge, and every structure in Blackridge is of identical construction and roughly identical condition, and there is no structure outside Blackridge within walking distance of the mine, and the company's lease agreement, a document Harley signed in 1901 and does not have a copy of because workers were not given copies, specifies that housing is contingent on employment and may be terminated without notice upon cessation of employment, strike activity, or behavior deemed inimical to company operations. Behavior deemed inimical to company operations. Harley has thought about this phrase. He has thought about it in the dark of the mine, lying in a seam 40 inches high with a pick in his hands, thinking in the way you think when your body is working automatically and your mind has no other occupation. Behavior deemed inimical to company operations. Speaking to a man from the United Mine Workers of America is behavior deemed inimical to company operations. Attending a meeting in another man's house to discuss wages is behavior deemed inimical to company operations. Writing a letter to a newspaper about conditions in the Blackridge mine is behavior deemed inimical to company operations, and the letter would likely never reach the newspaper anyway because mail delivery in Blackridge is conducted through the company post office, operated by a company employee, and the company has made clear, through means that require no written policy, that correspondence of a particular character may experience difficulties in transit. This is how you build a total surveillance environment without calling it surveillance. You make yourself the infrastructure. Mail passes through you. Information passes through you. The church passes through you. The school passes through you. Everything that a person needs to know about the outside world passes through a system you own, and you are under no obligation to let through the parts that are inconvenient. James Bratcher, 9 years old, attends the Blackridge Company School 5 days a week when the weather permits, and his father doesn't need his help at the surface doing chores. The school is a single room with a single teacher, Miss Aldrich, who is paid by the company, and who teaches a curriculum that includes reading, arithmetic, and American history. Though the American history tends to emphasize the blessings of industrial progress and the rightness of the relationship between a productive enterprise and the community that grows up around it. Miss Aldrich is not an evil woman. She was hired by the company to do a job, and the job is to produce literate workers, literate enough to read safety instructions and fill out forms, not so literate that they develop inconvenient notions about labor law or constitutional rights. She teaches what she was hired to teach and tries, in the margins, to teach more, and she has been spoken to twice about her margins. James will finish the company's school at the standard completion age, which in Blackridge means around 12 or 13, and then he will go into the mine. This is not a decision anyone has made explicitly. It is simply the shape of things. His father is in the mine. His uncles are in the mine. The mine is where the company needs workers. The workers are the company's primary product, in the sense that the company town produces workers the way a feedlot produces cattle, consistently, cheaply, in a manner designed to minimize the animal's awareness of its own situation. James will go into the mine. His settlement sheets will look like his father's settlement sheets. His debt will look like his father's debt. This is not a prediction. It is a design specification. The Baldwin-Felts agents are the visible edge of the system. There are usually 3 or 4 of them in Blackridge at any given time, wearing no uniform but identifiable by their bearing and their guns and the particular quality of their attention, which is the attention of men paid to watch. They deputized under the county sheriff, which gives their authority the color of law without the accountability of law. They can arrest, they can search, they can evict. They have done all 3 in Blackridge within recent memory. 2 years ago, a man named Petro Kovalenko, a Ukrainian immigrant who had been in the mine for 6 years, was found to have a pamphlet from the UMW in his coat pocket. The pamphlet described the union's wage demands and organizing principles. Kovalenko was fired that morning. His family's furniture was on the road by noon. Kovalenko's wife stood in the November mud with 2 children and a 3rd child on the way, and no place to go, and the consensus of Blackridge, a consensus achieved without discussion, out of pure shared animal understanding, was that this was the cost of the pamphlet, and the pamphlet had not been worth the cost. Harley Bratcher doesn't have a pamphlet. He does not attend meetings. He speaks to no one from the outside. He gets up at 4 in the morning, eats the breakfast Irene has made from the flour and salt pork purchased at company prices with company scrip, walks to the mine entrance, descends into the dark, and spends 9 hours removing coal from the earth so that the Cabell Consolidated Coal Company can sell that coal to people who are not Harley Bratcher, and will never meet Harley Bratcher, and have no particular reason to think about how the coal arrived at their hearths. He comes home in the afternoon, covered in coal dust, that he washes off at the shared pump on number 7 row, eats the dinner Irene has stretched across 6 people, helps James with his schoolwork when the boy is not too tired, and goes to sleep so that he can do it again tomorrow. He does not organize. He does not resist. He has a wife and 3 children and a balance sheet that already shows $47.30 in debt. And resistance in a company town is not a political act in any normal sense of the term. Resistance in a company town is a housing decision. He knows this. Irene knows this. The knowledge sits between them at the dinner table with a weight and solidity you could almost reach out and touch. Somewhere around 1910, Harley had a conversation with his brother-in-law Clement, who worked a mine in the next hollow over, owned by a different company with the same policies. They were talking about the math, the scrip, the markups, the settlement sheets, in the way that men in company towns talk about these things, which is quietly, in a tone stripped of anything that could be characterized as incitement, because the walls of company houses are thin, and the consequences of being overheard are concrete. Harley did the math out loud: gross earnings over 11 years, deductions over 11 years, estimated store markups over 11 years. He arrived at a number. He said the number out loud. Clement looked at it for a while. Then Clement said, "You know what that is, Harley." Harley said he did. They didn't say the word. They didn't need to. The word was robbery. The word was theft. The word was a system so thoroughly designed to extract maximum value from minimum protected labor that the individual worker's only choices were submission or destruction. The word, if you were a man named Eugene Debs, or a woman named Mother Jones, Mary Harris Jones, who was 75 years old in 1912, and had been fighting this specific system in these specific mountains for 20 years, was war. A different kind of war. A war of arithmetic and organization, and the slow, furious, entirely reasonable refusal to accept that the settlement sheet was the final word on the value of a human life. But that is not Harley's story. Not yet. Harley's story is a settlement sheet and a coffee tin under the floorboard, and a wife who knows the price of flour to the penny. His story is the trap before the rebellion, and it is worth staying in it for a while, in the specificity of it, in the exact texture of what it means to live inside an economy designed to keep you inside it, before moving to the other places where the same trap was set with different bait. 340 miles southeast of Black Ridge, in the red clay Piedmont of North Carolina, the trap has a different smell. It smells like cotton. More specifically, it smells like cotton lint, the fine white fibers that float in the air of a textile mill the way dust floats in sunlight, except that textile dust is not benign and does not simply settle. It settles in lungs. It settles over years, accumulating in the alveoli with the patient persistence of a slow catastrophe, producing a disease that the workers call brown lung, and the company doctors call bronchitis, and the company itself prefers not to call anything, because calling it something might imply liability for having put people in the air that caused it. Odell Suggs is 41 years old in the spring of 1929, and he has been breathing cotton lint for 22 years. He came to the Monarch Mill in Lincoln County, North Carolina, in 1907 at the age of 19, following his father and 2 uncles into the mill the same way a river follows the land. Not from choice exactly, but because the grade is all one direction and the current is strong. The Monarch Mill owns the mill village of 64 identical houses on 4 parallel streets, the company store on Oak Street, the Monarch Methodist Church. The Monarch in the name is not a reference to royalty, but to the company. And Odell has always found this funny in the way things are funny when they're also infuriating. The company school, and the water and power infrastructure that serves the entire village. It also owns the road, the only paved road for 4 miles in any direction. The mill village of Monarch is, if you are inclined to give credit where it has a narrow claim, better maintained than Black Ridge. The houses are painted, at company expense, every 3 years, white. Always white, an identical whiteness that makes the rows of houses look like something between a planned community and a military barracks, depending on your frame of mind. There is a communal garden space behind the third row where wives grow tomatoes and beans in the summer months. The Monarch store is well stocked. The mill school goes through 8th grade. These are genuine material advantages over the worst company towns, and Odell Suggs is aware of them. And awareness of them does not make him feel grateful so much as it makes him feel identified. The cage is painted well. The bars are spaced evenly. The lock is hidden behind a church that bears the company's name. The Suggs family occupies house number 37 on Cotton Street. 4 rooms, a porch, a shared privy at the end of the row. Odell works the weave room, tending 4 Northrop automatic looms. Until 1925, he tended 2 looms. In 1925, the company implemented what the foreman called the stretch-out, which is the textile industry's elegant euphemism for increasing the number of machines a worker tends without increasing the worker's pay, that is, doubling the labor while holding the wages constant. The stretch-out is justified, when it is justified at all, by improvements in loom technology that supposedly make each machine easier to operate. Whether the technology actually makes the work easier is a question that Odell, who tends 4 looms for the same pay he received tending 2, considers settled. It does not. His daughter Riva is 14. She works the spinning room, operating 3 spinning frames on the day shift, 6 days a week. She has been working in the mill since she was 12, which is illegal under the federal law as Odell understands it. But the federal law as applied in the Piedmont textile country in 1929 is a concept of remarkable flexibility, and the mill's employment records show Riva as 14, which she was not when she started, because the company's employment records show everyone at the minimally acceptable age because the company writes the employment records, and the company would prefer not to have federal inspectors examining the actual ages of the workers in the spinning room, many of whom are smaller than the frames they operate. Riva's hands are a record of her work. They are 14-year-old hands that look 10 years older, the knuckles dry and cracked, the skin of the fingertips hardened into a near leather from constant contact with the thread, the index finger and thumb of her right hand, worn in a specific pattern from the bobbin-changing motion she performs approximately 400 times in a typical day. She has not attended school since she was 10. The mill school, to its credit, runs through 8th grade, but running through 8th grade is only meaningful if you can attend 8th grade, and Riva was needed at the spinning frames before she reached 5th. She can read. She can do arithmetic. She does not know what she doesn't know, which is perhaps the most efficient feature of an education that was designed as a holding pen, a place for children to wait until they are old enough to be useful at the mill, which in Lincoln County, North Carolina, in 1929 is not very old at all. Riva's brother Tolly is 12 and works the doffer boy job in the carding room, pulling the full bobbins from the frames and replacing them with empty ones, a job that requires small hands and quick movements and a tolerance for being in motion constantly for 10 hours without pause, which Tolly has developed out of pure necessity. He was supposed to be in school. He is in the mill. The school exists, technically. The mill exists with more immediacy. The Suggs family's house on Cotton Street is contingent on the Suggs family's productive labor in the Monarch Mill, and 4 rooms contingent on productive labor requires more producers. This is the part that the company town system does to families that no other labor arrangement does in quite the same way. It makes the family's shelter dependent on the family's collective labor, which means the father's ability to leverage his labor against the employer is permanently weakened by the presence of his wife and children in company housing. If Odell Suggs were a single man in a boarding house in a real town, the worst consequence of a labor dispute would be unemployment. He would be hungry. He would be uncomfortable. He would eventually find other work. But Odell Suggs is a husband and a father in a company house on Cotton Street, and the worst consequence of a labor dispute is not unemployment. It is homelessness. Immediate, consequential, and extended to every person he loves. The company knows this. The company has structured the situation specifically because it knows this. The housing is not an amenity. It is a hostage. Odell knows he is a hostage. He has never put the word to it. But the feeling is the feeling of a man who understands that the exit door is real, and the cost of using it is real, and the cost is higher than he can pay. He speaks carefully in his own house, which has thin walls, and neighbors on both sides who are equally hostage and therefore possibly equally interested in demonstrating their own reliability to the company. He speaks carefully at the store, where the counterman is an employee of the company, and the conversations at the counter are not private in any meaningful sense. He speaks carefully at church, where the preacher, Reverend Coates, is a man of God whose salary is paid by the Monarch Mill Corporation, and whose theology has a consistent emphasis on the value of honest labor and the Christian imperative to fulfill one's contractual obligations. Odell, says his wife Louise one evening in March, speaking in the very low voice she uses for things that need to be said, "You hear about Gastonia?" He had heard about Gastonia. The strike at the Lorey Mill in Gastonia, North Carolina, had been news in the cotton country for weeks. First the walkout, then the union organizers from the National Textile Workers Union, then the violence, then the killing of Police Chief Aderholt, then the arrests, then the trial. It had been discussed in hushed voices throughout the mill village, in the shared spaces between houses, in the quick exchanges between women at the communal pump, in the looks men gave each other in the weave room when the foremen were at the far end of the floor. I heard. They shot that woman, Ella May, 5 children. I heard. Louise looked at him for a long moment, in the way she looked at him when she was determining whether he understood the full weight of a thing. Ella May Wiggins made up songs about it, about what they were doing to us. Her voice was flat, careful, the voice of a woman choosing words. They shot her for making up songs. I know. I'm just saying what it costs. Riva was at the table, ostensibly mending a piece of her mother's dress by the lamp. She had the stillness of a child who is being very careful not to appear to be listening, which is the stillness of a child who is listening with total attention. She had learned this skill in the mill, where you learn to be still and present simultaneously, where the ability to appear unaware while remaining completely alert was a survival skill. "Daddy," she said, without looking up from the mending, "what did the union want? At Gastonia?" Odell looked at Louise. Louise looked at the table. "Shorter hours," he said finally. "Fewer machines per worker." He paused. "Better pay." Riva's needle moved through the fabric. Did they get it? He could hear his own breathing in the silence before he answered. The walls of number 37 Cotton Street were not thick. "No," he said. "They didn't get it." "Will we ever?" She was still looking at the mending. Her voice was the voice of a girl asking a genuine question, the voice of someone who has not yet fully absorbed the lesson that certain genuine questions are too expensive to ask out loud in a company house. Odell looked at his daughter's hands, the cracked knuckles, the worn fingertips, the hands that had been shaped by the machines before she was old enough to understand what shape meant. He thought about what to say. He thought about the housing. He thought about Tolly in the carding room and Louise's lungs and his own lungs and the 4 walls around them and the company name on the church at the end of the street. "Not today," he said. "Not today, Riva." She nodded, very slightly, and kept mending. The lamp burned down. The thin walls kept nothing out. Ella May Wiggins, 30 years old, mother of 5 surviving children out of 9 born, was shot from a truck on September 14, 1929, while riding to a union meeting in Gastonia. She was a mill worker. She wrote union songs, stark, undecorated verses set to mountain music, about the lives of mill workers, about wages and hours and the stretch-out. and the men in suits who owned the buildings where the workers lived. She was the kind of person the company town system produced in exact proportion to its own excess, a person so thoroughly squeezed that the only thing that came out was truth, set to music. Her killers were never convicted. The union they were fighting was destroyed. The Lorey Mill, in the years following, operated as before. The scrip changed denominations. The ledger kept its columns. But the question Riva asked in the lamplight on Cotton Street in 1929, "Will we ever?" was not an idle question. It was the question underneath every settlement sheet and every company store receipt and every eviction notice and every Reverend Coates sermon about the Christian acceptance of earthly station. It was the question the company town system was architecturally designed to suppress, because the architecture of suppression was so total, so encompassing: house, store, church, school, doctor, police, mail, currency, that answering it required more than courage. It required the ability to absorb consequences that no individual family could absorb alone. It required solidarity, and solidarity required organization, and organization required communication, and communication in a company town required getting around the company, which is why, when the organizers came, they hid things in boot soles, union cards, meeting notices, copies of the Wagner Act's predecessor legislation, letters from organizers in other towns describing what was possible if workers held together. They folded them small and flat and tucked them into the space between the insole and the leather, and they walked through the company town with these pieces of paper under their feet, literally and exactly, and this was the level of precaution required to conduct basic labor organizing in an American company town in the 20th century, and if that doesn't clarify what company town means, nothing will. 450 miles north and west of Lincoln County, in the flat lakeside prairie of Illinois, the trap looked completely different, and was exactly the same. It looked, in fact, quite beautiful. Pullman, Illinois, in 1893, was by any objective architectural measure one of the finest planned communities in the United States. George Mortimer Pullman, founder of the Pullman Palace Car Company, the company that built the sleeping cars and dining cars that made long-distance rail travel in America a matter of some comfort rather than pure endurance, had designed his model town personally, with the assistance of architect Solon Spencer Beeman, and had opened it in 1880 as a demonstration that industrial capitalism and civilized human habitation were not contradictory concepts. The houses were brick, the streets were paved. There was a library, a theater, an arcade of shops. There was a market building, a church, non-denominational because Pullman was a complicated man theologically, though no less a man of total control, a school, parks, a hotel for visitors. The sewage system worked. The water system worked. Everything worked because George Pullman's company owned and operated all of it, and George Pullman did not tolerate things that didn't work. Cedric Foy arrived in Pullman in 1886, 7 years before the crisis, with a wife and the belief that he had found something genuinely good. He was from Cincinnati, where he had worked in a furniture factory under conditions he preferred not to dwell on, and the contrast between what he had come from and what he found in Pullman was stark enough that he wrote to his brother in Ohio to describe it. The clean streets, the library stocked with actual books, the theater that ran real performances, the brick house, actual brick, not thin planing, with a parlor and a kitchen and 2 bedrooms and a garden plot in back. He said in that letter that he had not believed places like this were built for working men, and that he had been wrong to disbelieve it, and that he was grateful. He was wrong to be grateful. The gratitude was premature. The beautiful trap is still a trap, and the beauty is, in some ways, the most sophisticated feature of the mechanism, because a man who believes he has found something good will defend it, will give more of himself to preserve it, will absorb more damage before he acknowledges the cage, because acknowledging the cage means acknowledging that the beautiful thing was never quite what he thought. Pullman's genius, as an operator of men, was that he understood this dynamic and leveraged it deliberately. He had not built the library for the workers. He had built it for the workers' disposition toward the company. A worker who lives beautifully is a worker who has something to lose. A worker who has something to lose is a worker who thinks twice. Ada Foy, Cedric's wife, worked at the Pullman Library. She was employed by the Pullman Company, which employed everyone in Pullman who was employed at all, which was everyone in Pullman, because everyone in Pullman lived there, because they worked for the Pullman Company. And living in Pullman required working for the Pullman Company, and working for the Pullman Company required living in Pullman, or at least required being able to afford no other option, which amounted to the same thing in practice. Ada ordered the books, cataloged them, staffed the desk 3 days a week, and ran reading groups for children on Saturday mornings. She was good at her job. She liked her job. She read everything in the library, including the newspapers, including the labor press, including, eventually, a pamphlet describing the wages and working conditions in the railcar shops in comparison to wages and working conditions in comparable industries in non-company town settings. A comparison that was not favorable to George Pullman, and that the pamphlet had clearly not been written to favor him. She read it in the library her employer had built, in the building her employer owned, in the chair she was paid by her employer to sit in while assisting the patrons of the library that the town her employer had designed contained. There was something almost classical about this, the information circulating within the very structure, designed to prevent it from being dangerous. She put the pamphlet back on the shelf and went home and told Cedric what it said. Cedric said he already knew most of it. Ada said she knew he knew. They sat with that for a while. The crisis, when it came from arithmetic. It came from the terrible clarity of two numbers placed in relation to each other in the autumn of 1893. The first number, wages. In August and September of 1893, with the nation in the grip of the worst financial panic it had experienced since the Civil War, the Panic of 1893, which would eventually produce an unemployment rate of around 17%, and which would, in its cascading effects, reshape American politics for a generation, the Pullman Company reduced wages, not slightly. The reduction averaged between 25 and 40%, depending on the department and the workers' classification. Men who had been earning $2.50 per day in the car shops were now earning $1.50 or $1.75. Some men were earning less. Some men were being paid in partial scrip against future earnings. Some men, at the bottom of the pay scale, were receiving settlement checks for amounts in the single digits after deductions. The second number, rent. George Pullman did not reduce rents, not by a penny. The brick houses remained at their 1892 rates. The water rates remained. The gas rates remained. The library subscription remained. The town's revenues from rent, utilities, services remained exactly where they had been when workers were earning 40% more. This is the math of captivity, made so clear it is almost elegant. He owns your labor and your shelter. He reduces one and keeps the other. You now work to pay rent to the man who cut your wages. Where do you go? You could leave. Pullman was not technically preventing anyone from leaving, but leaving requires money, and money requires savings, and savings require surplus income, and surplus income requires wages above the level of necessary expenditures, and wages above necessary expenditures have just been reduced by a third. The math says, you stay. The math says, you stay and you work, and you pay your rent to the man who just made it impossible to pay your rent. The math says, the door is open and the door is locked. Cedric Foy did the math in October of 1893. He did it at the kitchen table while Ada made tea. He wrote the numbers on the back of a settlement envelope. Monthly rent, $14. Monthly gas, $2.50. Monthly water, $1.80. Monthly earnings at new wage rate, approximately $35 gross, before company store purchases, before the other minor deductions that accumulated with the thoroughness of a leak. He looked at the numbers, and he looked at Ada, and she looked at the numbers, and they both arrived at the same place simultaneously and without discussion. "It's not possible," he said. "No," she said. "It's not." He knew it wasn't possible when he did it. Ada poured the tea. Of course he did. This is the difference between Cedric's anger and Harley Bratcher's anger, or one of the differences. Cedric arrived at his anger through betrayal, through the collapse of a belief that had been allowed to grow, and betrayal produces a particular quality of fury, precise, focused, personal. He had believed in Pullman. He had believed that the beautiful town was evidence of good faith, that the library and the theater and the paved streets were a compact, an implicit agreement between employer and worker that the relationship would be conducted with some minimum of mutual regard. He now understood that they were not a compact. They were a display. They were the cage's paint job. And the man who had built the cage had painted it this way, specifically because a well-painted cage is a more effective cage than a bare one, because a man who believes he lives somewhere good will stay longer and fight less than a man who knows from the first day that he is in a trap. Eugene Victor Debs understood this. Debs, the president of the American Railway Union, was not a man who needed explaining to about company towns. He had been explaining them to other people for years. When the Pullman workers sent delegates to the ARU's convention in Chicago in June of 1894, thin men who had been working at reduced wages for 9 months while paying undiminished rent, men whose settlement sheets had entered negative territory, men some of whom had received actual paychecks for amounts less than $1 after all deductions. Debs listened, and then the American Railway Union voted to boycott Pullman cars, not to strike the Pullman plant, to boycott Pullman cars, to refuse across the entire rail network that the ARU represented, to handle trains carrying Pullman sleeping cars. The boycott was intended to cripple the railway system broadly enough that the economic pressure would force Pullman to negotiate. It worked, in the sense that the rail system was significantly disrupted. It failed, in the sense that President Grover Cleveland sent in federal troops. It is worth pausing on this for a moment. The President of the United States dispatched the United States Army to break a labor strike, not to prevent violence. The strike had been largely peaceful, but to restore rail service and, more broadly, to demonstrate that the federal government would not permit labor organizing to become an effective check on industrial capital. Attorney General Richard Olney, who had previously been a railroad lawyer and who would return to being a railroad lawyer after his tenure in the cabinet, obtained a federal injunction against the strike under the Sherman Antitrust Act, a law passed to prevent monopolies, applied with remarkable creativity against a union. The injunction made it illegal to continue the strike. Debs was arrested for contempt of court. 30 men died in the unrest surrounding the strike's violent suppression, most of them in confrontations with federal troops and the state militia. The Pullman strike failed. Cedric Foy went back to work. He went back at the reduced wages. He paid the undiminished rent. He sat across the kitchen table from Ada, who was reading about the trial of Eugene Debs in a newspaper in the library of the town George Pullman had built, and they both understood that the door had been demonstrated to be locked in a particularly final way. What happened to Pullman, the man is its own small irony. George Pullman died in 1897, 3 years after the strike, wealthy and relatively untroubled. He was buried in Graceland Cemetery in Chicago in a lead-lined mahogany casket, which was then encased in concrete, which was then surrounded by steel rails bolted together, precautions taken against the possibility that his workers, given the opportunity, might dig him up. This is not apocryphal. This actually happened. The man who built the beautiful cage was buried with the engineering logic of someone who understood, at the end, that beautiful cages produce particular feelings in the people who lived in them. The Supreme Court, for what it was worth, found Pullman's complete ownership of the town unconstitutional in 1898, in United States versus Debs, though the ruling was more about the company's monopolistic structure than about the rights of workers per se. The company town of Pullman was eventually incorporated into the city of Chicago, losing its status as a private fiefdom. Cedric Foy was long gone by then, having left for Cleveland in 1896 with Ada and a view of employer benevolence that required surgical reconstruction. He never entirely trusted the beautiful thing again, which is perhaps the most durable lesson of having lived in Pullman, that the bars look better at a certain distance, and distance is exactly what a cage is designed to prevent. Now step back. Step back from the coal dust of Blackridge and the cotton lint of Monarch and the brick streets of Pullman, and look at the shape of the thing in full. 3 industries, 3 regions, hundreds of miles separating Harley Bratcher's settlement sheet from Odell Suggs's stretch-out production quota from Cedric Foy's wage cut without rent reduction calculation. 3 families living in 3 different traps with 3 different names on the buildings. 3 communities where the church, the school, the doctor, the police, the store, the house, the mail, and the money were all owned by the same entity that owned the workers' labor. Different raw materials, different climates, different ethnographies, but identical architecture, as if someone had drawn up a blueprint for the maximum extraction of labor value from minimum protected human beings and distributed it across the continent as a franchise opportunity. Someone had, more or less, not a single person, not a conspiracy in the traditional sense, but a logic. The logic of the company town emerged naturally, some would say inevitably, from the combination of 2 factors: industrial operations in locations without pre-existing infrastructure, and a workforce with no political power to demand anything better. When a coal company opened a mine in the mountains of West Virginia in 1890, there was no town there. There was no housing, no store, no church, no school. The company had to build them or provide them because workers needed to live somewhere. Having built them, the company confronted a simple choice: charge market rates and allow independent alternatives, or charge whatever the market would bear because there was no market. The second option was also the more profitable option. The second option was chosen. 2,500 times across a continent, over 80 years, the second option was chosen with sufficient consistency that company town became a recognized category, a known thing, a named system, a specific architecture of control that workers recognized on arrival the same way a bird recognizes a cage on arrival, by the geometry. Over 2,500 company towns, 3% of America living in places owned by their employer. This was not a Southern problem. This was not a coal problem. This was a capitalism problem, the logical endpoint of what happens when one entity controls both your income and your expenses. When your employer sets your wage and also sets the price of everything you spend that wage on, the wage becomes notional. The number on the settlement sheet becomes a placeholder. What you actually earn is whatever the company allows to remain after extracting everything the company can extract without your dying. And even that line was sometimes crossed. The lumber camps of the Pacific Northwest were the company town in its most elemental form, stripped of even the pretense of the beautiful cage, because there was no one to impress. The great lumber operations of Washington, Oregon, and Northern California, cutting through forests of Douglas fir and Sitka spruce and cedar that had grown for centuries in the kind of silence that makes men feel temporary, built their operations in places where the nearest town might be 50 miles of corduroy logging road. Logs laid perpendicular across the roadbed to prevent vehicles from sinking in the mud. Away. A worker who wanted to leave had 50 miles of that road, on foot or on a horse he didn't own, with no money in his pocket because his money was commissary credit, and nowhere particular to go when he got there, because the company had placed him on a blacklist as a condition of his departure. The isolation was the control mechanism. In coal country, the mountains served the same function as the distance. In the Carolina Piedmont, it was the poverty, the complete absence of any alternative economy within which a mill family could survive. The mechanism varied. The function was identical. The industrial workers of the world, the IWW, known as the Wobblies for reasons that historians debate, and the members never seem to find necessary to explain, understood the lumber camps with the specificity of people who had been in them. The IWW was a union of a particular character, not a craft union organizing skilled workers in a single trade, but an industrial union attempting to organize all workers in an industry regardless of skill level, and beyond that, a radical union with a vision of industrial democracy that made the more conservative American Federation of Labor look like the Chamber of Commerce. The Wobblies went into the lumber camps in the 1910s because the AFL wouldn't, because the AFL organized carpenters and machinists and left the bunkhouse workers, the fallers and buckers and chokermen who did the brutal physical work of bringing the trees down, to the companies. The Wobblies came with their songs and their red cards and their little red songbooks, which were small enough to fit in a breast pocket, and they organized in the bunkhouses at night by lantern light, which was a thing the lumber companies found extremely inconvenient. The response was predictable: eviction, blacklisting, the hiring of private guards, the involvement of the local law enforcement that was, in timber country, typically sympathetic to the employers who provided the local economy's entire base. There was violence. There was organized violence, not the spontaneous kind. The Everett Massacre in November 1916, Wobblies arriving by boat in Everett, Washington, to support a shingle weavers' strike, were met at the dock by the county sheriff and a party of deputized vigilantes, mostly members of the local commercial club. Gunfire was exchanged. 5 Wobblies confirmed dead, dozens wounded, 2 of the deputies dead, scores unaccounted for and presumed drowned in the bay. The exact number of dead was never established because some bodies were never found. The Centralia Massacre 3 years later, Armistice Day, 1919, IWWW members defending their Union Hall against an attack by American Legion members during a parade. 4 Legion members killed. Wesley Everest, an IWW member and World War I veteran, shot, captured, castrated, and lynched by a mob that evening. The coroner's jury found that he had died of self-inflicted wounds while in the custody of unknown parties, which stands as one of the more remarkable feats of institutional euphemism in American history. The Hawaiian sugar plantations operated a version of the company town that added a dimension the mainland operations lacked: race as an administrative technology. The sugar plantations, owned by the Big Five corporations, Dole and Castle and Cook and Theo Davies and the others, operating across the islands with the same comprehensive ownership of land and labor and infrastructure that defined company towns everywhere, housed their workers in camps organized by ethnicity: Japanese workers in the Japanese camp, Filipino workers in the Filipino camp, Portuguese workers in their own section, Korean workers, Puerto Rican workers, Chinese workers, each group separated from the others by company policy and by the physical layout of the plantation village, each group operating under a slightly different contract and pay structure, each group encouraged to view the others with the suspicion that comes from competition for the limited good favor of the employer. The divide and conquer strategy is not a subtle instrument, but it is an effective one. A plantation that employs workers of 6 nationalities who cannot easily communicate with each other, who have different cultural frameworks for labor relations and different practical experiences of employer authority, who have been deliberately housed and paid in ways that create rivalry rather than solidarity. That plantation is much harder to organize than a plantation where workers share a common background and a common vocabulary for their common situation. The plantation companies understood this. They understood it the way they understood the scrip and the company store, not as an ethical judgment, but as an operational principle. Keep the workers divided. Keep the workers in debt. Keep the workers in company housing. Keep the workers' mail going through company systems. Keep the workers' children in company schools. Keep the workers' health care in company clinics where the company doctor's primary loyalty is to the company's workforce management requirements, rather than the patient's health. Keep all of this in place simultaneously, comprehensively, with no gaps, because a gap in the system is a crack through which organization can enter. The 1920 sugar strike in Hawaii was organized across the ethnic divisions, Japanese workers and Filipino workers striking together, which the plantation companies had not expected, and which they found considerably more alarming than the routine strikes of single ethnic groups that they had managed before. The 1924 Filipino strike was harder and longer and bloodier. The system, in both cases, survived. The strikes failed. The plantations continued. The scrip continued. The company housing continued. But the act of organizing across the racial divisions, of finding the common arithmetic beneath the different languages and different camps, was itself a thing of importance, a demonstration that the divide and conquer strategy, like all company town strategies, depended on the workers not seeing the architecture of the trap clearly enough to reason their way out of it. The architecture was always the same. Industry, region, racial composition, era, these were variables. The architecture was a constant. The resistance was also, ultimately, constant. Paint Creek and Cabin Creek, West Virginia, 1912 and 1913. The summer and fall, when Harley Bratcher kept his head down and his coffee tin under the floorboard, and his brother-in-law Clement worked in the next hollow, and they had that conversation about the numbers. The Paint Creek Cabin Creek district was a coal field of particular hardness, even by West Virginia standards, where hardness was the baseline. The operators had refused to negotiate a contract with the United Mine Workers of America for years. The miners struck in April 1912. The company response was comprehensive and immediate. Eviction. Miners and their families, hundreds of families, were turned out of company housing within days of the strike's beginning. In November, in the West Virginia mountains, with children, the Union and sympathizers from communities outside the district set up tent colonies in the creek bottoms, rows of canvas tents on the rocky ground, visible from the company's property lines, populated by families that the company's eviction process had rendered technically homeless without technically killing. The tent colonies persisted through the winter. The winter was cold in the mountains in the way that the mountains are cold when you are living in canvas. Mother Jones came. Mary Harris Jones, 75 years old by some accounts, 83 by others, she was imprecise about her birth year in a way that enhanced her legend, came to Cabin Creek to address the strikers, which she did in her usual style, without a prepared text, without deference to the company guards watching from the hillside, without any apparent concern for the legal consequences of organizing labor in a state where the mine operators owned the legislature. She was arrested, multiple times. Put under military guard, at one point, by the military commission that the governor of West Virginia had convened to manage the strike, in an action of legally contested character. She told a Senate subcommittee about it afterward, in testimony that was precise and unadorned and worth reading in full. The strike eventually ended in a partial compromise. Some operators agreed to some UMW recognition, others did not. The tent colonies emptied. The evicted families returned to company housing, those whose company jobs had survived the winter, or dispersed to other coal fields, or simply scattered. It did not end the company town system in the West Virginia coal fields, but it demonstrated the system at its most naked, with the eviction notices as the bottom of the trap, the moment when the company's total ownership of the worker's life was exercised without ambiguity or pretense, the moment when a family standing in November with their furniture on a dirt road understood what the settlement sheet had always been saying, and it demonstrated something else, that the workers knew. They knew the trap. They had known it for years. The knowledge had not been suppressed by the company store, or the company church, or the company mail. It had been suppressed by the math, by the impossibility, for any individual family, of bearing the cost of resistance. The cost of resistance in a company town was not a paycheck. The cost of resistance was a tent colony in the mountains in November with your children. The company had made resistance indistinguishable from self-destruction, and this was not an accident. It was the point. The asymmetry was the point. A worker in a normal town, in a city with competing employers and an open housing market, and an independent press and police who answered to an elected government, could strike, and the cost of striking was no wages during the strike. This is a real cost. People go hungry. Bills go unpaid. Strikers in normal towns also suffer. But the cost is bounded. It is bounded by the fact that the employer doesn't also own the house, and the store, and the school, and the doctor, and the church, and the money. The strike costs the paycheck. The rest of the life remains. In a company town, a strike costs the paycheck and the house, and the children's school, and the doctor, and the access to food, and the community you have built, and the church where you were married, and sometimes, if the jurisdiction's laws are of the right character, your legal freedom. The company didn't just raise the cost of resistance. They made resistance indistinguishable from self-destruction, designed the environment so that the act of saying no to your employer was simultaneously the act of saying no to shelter, to food, to medicine, to your children's future. They made the two things the same thing, on purpose, by design, as a calculated feature of the system. Every company town manager, every operator, every George Pullman, and every coal company president understood this at the operational level. The point of owning the housing was not primarily the rent. The rent was a modest revenue stream. The point of owning the housing was that ownership of housing was ownership of the worker's threshold for resistance. This is why they fought so hard to keep it. This is why the system persisted for 80 years across industries and regions and generations of workers. Because it worked. Because a worker who cannot strike is a worker who cannot bargain. Because a worker who cannot bargain is a worker who can be paid whatever the employer decides is convenient. Because an employer who decides the wage and also controls the currency and also owns the store and also sets the prices in the store can define what the worker actually receives in real goods, in actual nutrition, in the material substance of a life, completely independently of what the settlement sheet says. The settlement sheet can say $2.10. The system can deliver 47 cents worth of flour and salt pork, purchased at an 80% markup with a currency worth nothing outside the company's property. And the worker can finish the month in deeper debt than he started it. And the law of the relevant state in the relevant year may say that leaving this situation constitutes breach of contract. And he does it again tomorrow, and next week, and next year, and for 11 years. And his son goes into the mine. Because what else is there? There was eventually something else. The something else took the form of legislation, which is to say it took the form of politics, which is to say it took the form of decades of organizing and striking and dying, and losing, and starting again, and losing again, and eventually, in the middle of the worst economic catastrophe in American history, when the unemployment rate was 25%, and the political ground had shifted enough that certain kinds of change became possible that had not been possible before. It took the form of two laws. The National Labor Relations Act of 1935, known as the Wagner Act after its Senate sponsor, established the legal right of workers to organize unions and required employers to bargain collectively with those unions. It created the National Labor Relations Board to oversee union elections and handle unfair labor practices. It was not a perfect law, and it was not applied without resistance, and the resistance was substantial and sometimes violent, but it changed the legal architecture within which labor organizing occurred. The right to organize was now a matter of federal law, rather than a matter of how many Pinkertons the company could afford. The Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938 established minimum wages and maximum hours at the federal level, imposing a floor that company town operators could no longer easily bypass by paying in scrip at prices that rendered the nominal wage irrelevant. These two laws, combined with the broader labor movement's gains during the New Deal period, began the process of making the company town economically and legally untenable. You couldn't pay in scrip if the minimum wage was denominated in US dollars. You couldn't evict organizers if organizing was a federally protected right. The legal ground shifted. It shifted slowly. Company towns did not vanish in 1935 or 1938. They persisted in some form well into the 1950s, particularly in the most remote and isolated operations: lumber camps, certain coal operations, some mining towns in the Southwest. The last significant company towns were still operating in the late 1950s and early 1960s, finally dissolved by a combination of labor law enforcement, union contracts, worker mobility, and the simple economic reality that maintaining a comprehensive parallel infrastructure was increasingly costly, relative to the benefits when workers had the legal tools to demand better conditions regardless. Some company towns transitioned into independent municipalities, selling the housing to the workers, incorporating as towns, establishing their own governments. Others simply collapsed when the mine or the mill or the camp closed, leaving behind the infrastructure of control without the entity doing the controlling. Empty houses in rows, a company store with the windows out, a church with no preacher, a school with no company to fund it. Ghost towns, in the most literal sense. The ghost not of people, but of a system, haunting the geography where it once operated with such comprehensive efficiency. Walk through one of these towns today, and you can. They exist in the hollows of West Virginia and the scrub of the Carolina Piedmont and the logged-over hills of the Pacific Northwest. And you see the architecture of the trap in its bones. The houses in rows, the store at the center, the church at the end of the street, the company-built infrastructure outlasting the company's authority over it by decades. The way a cage outlasts its original purpose. You see it, and you recognize it, the pattern, the logic, the overwhelming comprehensiveness of a system designed to eliminate every exit simultaneously. The scrip tokens ended up in museums. Some of them. The better preserved ones, the aluminum and brass ones that held their shape, found their way into the collections of the West Virginia State Archives, the North Carolina Museum of History, various county historical societies. Some ended up in antique shops, where they sell for between $5 and $20, depending on condition and provenance, purchased by collectors of Americana who find them interesting as objects. The feel of them, the stamped company names, the denominations that were designed to look like money while being something else entirely. People buy them as curiosities. They hold them in their palms the way you held one at the beginning of this story, feeling the weight of half an ounce, reading the stamped name, turning it over to read the denomination. They don't buy what they represent. A system where your employer owned your house, your store, your money, your church, your children's school, and your legal right to leave. They don't buy 11 years of settlement sheets in a coffee tin under the floorboard. They don't buy Irene Bratcher memorizing the price of flour because precision was the only weapon available to her. They don't buy Reva Suggs's hands at 14, worn leather at the fingertips, asking her father a question he couldn't safely answer in his own house. They don't buy Cedric Foy at the kitchen table with a settlement envelope and a pencil, arriving at the number that told him the beautiful thing was a cage. They buy the token. They put it in a jar with other curiosities. They look at it sometimes and think, what a strange thing. What a relic. What a historical oddity. That system has a name. It's called a company town. It's also called other things, depending on how honest you're being and how carefully you look at the present. The big tech campus concept, the sprawling corporate headquarters with company housing nearby, company cafeterias, company gyms, company buses, company social infrastructure, is defensively described by its proponents as employee perks. And some of it is, genuinely, more generous than anything Blackridge or Monarch offered. The housing is better than the thin plank houses on number 7 row. The cafeteria food does not have an 80% markup. There is no company scrip. There is no Baldwin Felts agency on the payroll. Let's be clear about the differences, because clarity requires acknowledging them. Now let's be equally clear about the similarities. If your employer provides your housing, your transportation, your food, your healthcare, and your primary social environment, and losing your job means losing all of these simultaneously, the structure of your dependence is not categorically different from Cedric Foy's dependence on George Pullman. The specific quality of the housing differs. The mechanism of control is recognizable. The question of what you're willing to do and say and organize for, knowing that the cost of dissent is not just your income, but your home and your social world, is a question that the architect of the Pullman model town would recognize immediately. The gig economy presents a different version of the same architecture. The app-dependent contractor who earns below minimum wage on a per-task basis, whose access to income requires a company-controlled platform, who has no employment protections and no union rights, and whose entire working life is mediated by an algorithm that the contractor cannot see and cannot appeal to, is not in a company town in any geographic sense. But the logic of the thing, the employer's control of the currency of work, the platform access, the lack of alternatives, try to work independently without the platform, the dependency structures that make dissent expensive, is logic that the operators of company towns would recognize as their own. The script changed. The architecture didn't. This is not a comforting observation, and it is not intended to be. The company town is not history in the way that the spinning jenny is history, replaced by a better technology and left behind. It is history in the way that debt bondage is history, a structure of control that changes its exterior while preserving its interior logic, that adapts to new regulatory environments the way water adapts to new containers, that reappears under new names in new industries because the underlying conditions that produced it, an employer's interest in maximum control over a dependent labor force, have not changed. Harley Bratcher's arithmetic is not antique. Reva Suggs's question, will we ever, is not settled. The settlement sheet changes its format. It does not change its function. The script token sits in a jar of curiosities in someone's study, and someone picks it up sometimes, turns it over, reads the stamped name, feels the weight of it, puts it back. Half an ounce. The weight of a leash. That's what it always was.